We unfortunately start tonight with some breaking news out of New York City. A couple hours ago, a rented truck drove down the bike path on the west side in Lower Manhattan. At the end of the carnage, 8 people were dead and injuring as many as a dozen others. There is no active threat as we report to you this evening. The attacker, as you see there in the video, in custody as we speak. President Trump has been briefed on the situation. This is being called, as we speak tonight, an act of terror. Multiple sources saying the attacker shouted reportedly Allah Akbar while he was on the street. Let's bring in now Maggie Rulli is reporting live from Lower Manhattan.
You're saying, is that 30 seconds? I'm sorry.
Okay, we're gonna go back to Maggie in a second here, but as we've heard now from a press conference from both the governor, mayor, etc., this is a contained situation. But obviously, a lot of questions still remain. But let's bring you up to date with the very latest as to where we are. For that, Maggie Rulli once again in Lower Manhattan.
A couple of blocks to my right, this entire area is on lockdown and what authorities are now calling an act of terror.
This was an act of terror, and a particularly cowardly act of terror aimed at innocent civilians.
Emergency vehicles poured into the area near Ground Zero. Police shutting down Manhattan's West Side Highway in the shadow of the World Trade Center #1 building. Initial reports of a truck plowing into people and shots fired, people scrambling for safety.
I was walking down the road. I see a group, it was 2 women and children. So they're running. I hear one of the young girls say he's got a gun, he's got a gun. So at that point I turn around, but around 30 seconds to a minute after that, I start hearing gunshots. So it was probably around 5 to 10 gunshots, one after another, very fast.
Police say the suspect got out of the vehicle with an imitation firearm and was shot by police officers. He is now in custody.
That's right, 3:05 p.m. A male driving a rented Home Depot pickup truck entered the West Side Highway bicycle path at Houston Street, began driving southbound, striking a number of pedestrians and bicyclists along the route. At Chambers Street, the truck collided with a school bus, injuring 2 adults and 2 children. After the collision, the driver of the truck, a 29-year-old male, exited the vehicle brandishing 2 handguns. A uniformed police officer assigned to the 1st Precinct confronted the subject and shot him in the abdomen. The subject was wounded and transported to a local hospital.
Emergency response officials are taking away injured victims on stretchers. Police and the FBI are now investigating. Authorities have named the suspect as 29-year-old Sayfullah Saipov from Tampa, Florida, and officials are saying they are going to respond to this with a massive police presence, and then as of right now, Halloween will go on as planned. Maggie Rulli, ABC News, New York.
Thank you very much, Maggie. It bears repeating, in less than an hour, and for those of you in our region, you know this very well, you have that huge parade down in the Village. And just think about logistics, people with masks and costumes and everything else. Less than 2 hours after that tragedy happening, there's debates as to whether or not New York just showing its resilience in the face of terror versus also security issues. But as of now, to reiterate from both the NYPD and all the officials, this was a singular act. Lone wolf, the person in custody right now, they believe he did not act in concert and he acted independently. Okay, we do have reaction from this, of course. You heard from the police commissioner. Let's hear from the president, because President Trump responded soon after in as is his way, Twitter, saying, in New York City, looks like another attack by a very sick and deranged person. Law enforcement is following this closely, not in the USA, but it was on American soil. I want to take now a soundbite from that press conference that you heard from Commissioner O'Neill. This, Governor Andrew Cuomo.
The new terrorist tactic, which they've called for publicly, are these lone wolves who commit an act of terror. This is all very preliminary. It's only been a couple of hours, but at this point there's no evidence to suggest a wider plot or a wider scheme, but the actions of one individual who meant to cause pain and harm and probably death and the resulting terror.
All right, let me bring in Andrew Whitman, senior political correspondent. But obviously, Andrew, we're going to talk politics later. It was a huge day in Washington, but everything takes a backseat, obviously, with what happened this afternoon. It began what we believed as road rage, where there was an accident first reported. They thought there was two vehicles. Quickly, that turned into something far else. But for folks who aren't as familiar or trying to piece this together, let's talk about where this took place here, because this was 20 blocks long, and we're talking about on the west side of Manhattan.
Yeah, it's the far west side of Manhattan, West Street. The truck apparently jumped into the bike lane at Houston Street and then drove south down the bike path that goes to the west of West Street. 9/10 of a mile as the crow flies. That's about 18 city blocks, which is an enormously long period of time for, frankly, I mean, you're just driving down a street for 18 blocks. You're lucky if you get that many green lights. But to go for that long with a truck going down the bike path, and one can only imagine, you know, you have to assume that most of the people he hit were the ones facing the other way.
And just for atmospherics, but it was a beautiful day today. People came out early.
And it's Halloween,
right?
which means those bike crowds, the bike lanes were probably that much more crowded, both with
and we know,
trick-or-treaters
unfortunately, children
and
were
bikers.
among the victims here today. Parents coming home early, doing trick-or-treating. But the video, Andrew, of the man who's been identified as a 29-year-old from Tampa, Florida. Reportedly, he got out of the vehicle with brandishing two weapons. We know those weren't guns now.
Well, they were apparently the NYPD is saying it was a paintball gun and a pellet gun.
Right.
I mean, imagine. I mean, you can go off here and imagine what might have been or how much worse it could have been if those were actual weapons as opposed to those. But even just the people who saw it nearby, terrified by the sight of this guy brandishing weapons publicly, and from a distance, impossible to know whether it's an actual weapon or whether it was what it turned out to be, a paintball and a pellet gun.
It's being reported. He yelled "Al Akbar"
Correct.
when he exited the vehicle before he was taken down by police. He was shot. We believe in the abdomen, and he is now in custody. They would not release the name of the hospital for obvious reasons, for security reasons, that he is being treated and then detained at. But Andrew, we've seen this scene in different shades happen elsewhere. We've seen lone wolf attacks, but not so much in the States before until today.
Well, you heard Governor Cuomo mention that this is the new form of terrorism, that this is what ISIS wants its people to do. And we have seen this plenty of times before around the world. And we just, since 2014, we have a brief list that shows how many times terrorists have employed the use of a vehicle in a public space as a weapon. And the first report of it was in Jerusalem in October of 2014. The best known incident took place in Nice in France, where 84 people were killed, and there we see the list. Berlin, 12 dead in December of 2016. Two consecutive attacks in June in 2017 in London, one of those being the London Bridge attack. 13 were killed in Barcelona, and now in the final day of October, 8 so far killed in lower Manhattan in Tribeca. And this is one of those things where, and we heard this at the press conference too, for something like Times Square at New Year's Eve, the police presence is there. Or for Times Square or Herald Square, which are closed to vehicular traffic, there are pylons, concrete posts that prevent cars from getting there. Same thing with federal buildings downtown. You really can't do that with sidewalks or bike paths or things like that. You can try to put them up where you can, but there's really no good way, unless you want these concrete posts along every inch of bike path in New York City. The truck jumped the curb at Houston Street, could have easily jumped the curb a half block south of Houston Street. So it's one of these new realities of terrorism that it is impossible to prevent. And even if you do, odds are they'll figure out a new tactic that gets behind those defenses too.
These lone wolf attacks is described here. People in the intelligence and security world say there's, as you said, there's a limit as to what one can or can't do. This is going to open up more dialogue and debate in this country. But I will say, by all accounts, the response by the NYPD prevented this from becoming far worse here.
Oh, absolutely. And within a few moments of the car stopping, apparently an officer from, I believe it was the 1st Precinct, fired a shot and struck the suspect in the abdomen. And for investigators, the suspect is alive.
Yep.
I mean, most of these attacks that we showed you that list of before, most of these lone wolf attacks, the attacker intentionally kills himself or dies in the attack, at least investigators will be able to interrogate the suspect, find out what happened. I've seen reports that he is a green card holder and was not born in the United States but is in the United States legally. That begs the question, at what point, where was he radicalized, if in fact he was a radicalized jihadist terrorist? Was it something that was done online? And we know that ISIS has posted a lot of videos online trying to find new adherents. Was this somebody who was radicalized out of the country and came back to the country? These are all the questions that we don't know and that investigators will be able to ask this suspect as he's in a local hospital.
Well, there's a lot of outstanding questions out of this for both investigators, but also more broadly. And when we come back, Andrew and I are going to bring in a couple panelists in here and begin some of the obvious questions that come off in the aftermath of any attack, but especially one so close to home. A former spokesperson for Mayor de Blasio will join us as to how in the aftermath of incidents like this, communication works, where you measure both security, but also calming the folks, and then also figuring out what to do next, especially when you're within an hour of a huge parade and you're in the weekend of the New York Marathon. We'll get into all those questions and also much more in a busy day in Washington as well, straight ahead.